Now we want to move on to see whether this major factor, like in the raw model, 2/3 of the gender wage gap is associated with the family wage gaps. And then it remains pretty stable with adding the human capital and job attributes, but it can decline a little bit with the occupation added. And how does that relationship differ? Is it uniform across the different race categories? And the short answer is no. So that's one of the important caveats that we are going to talk about. So overall, the gender wage gap tend to be smaller among the racial groups compared to white workers. And that is most pronounced among parents. So here, I just only present the gender wage gap among parents by different race groups. So, for example, married parents, you can see white workers actually has the largest gender wage gap, whereas among Black workers, you don't see much. It is pretty small and virtually non-existent. And Hispanic workers is much smaller compared to white workers. It is across the board pretty similar across all these marital status groups among parents. So that translates into the wage gap analysis as well. So compared to what we saw in the raw model, it was about 1/3 of them was explained by the parents, a parenthood penalty, gender differentiated effects on wages among parents. So it is now about 50% among white workers. So it is a lot larger. And then among Black workers, a coefficient is close to 0, and contribution is pretty small. And Hispanic workers as well, it's larger compared to Black workers, but much smaller compared to white workers' coefficients. So meaning that this gender wage gap is strongly associated with the parenthood wage gap is only a story for the white workers, not Black workers, and that it's a lesser extent for the Hispanic workers. That's what this analysis suggests. When we are adding the coefficients, adding the covariates, the human capital factors and job attributes, the relationship remains pretty similar. Hispanic workers' contribution increased a little bit. The estimates are so imprecise, so we can't draw too much conclusion out of it. For the white workers, it remains still pretty large, close to 40% contribution to the gender wage gap. We did not examine the model 3, which is with the education added, because Black workers and Hispanic workers, the sample size is simply just too small to add 510 additional occupation categories. So we did not present that model here. So in sum, the bottom line, our top line result is actually when we are looking at the labor market as a whole, and we see the very strong association between gender and family wage gaps. And again, 1/3 of the overall gender wage gap is associated with the gender differentiated wage returns to parenthood, meaning motherhood wage penalty and fatherhood wage premium. And another 1/3 is with the gender differentiated returns to marriage. So that's top line of our result. But there are two important caveats. But 2/3 of them are intertwined with the family wage gap, means that another 1/3, the remaining 1/3, is not associated with the marriage or parenthood. So there's still a substantial portion that is not associated with the family demography. And also the gender wage gap among never married childless adults, they are small, but definitely not negligible, especially, of course, compared to married parents, who shows a 22% of the gender wage gap. 6 or the 10% seems smaller, but they are not, 10% especially is not a negligible amount. So that's another one of the caveat. And the other caveat is what we saw from the decomposition model is that strong association between gender and family wage gap actually is only a story for the white workers. It really does not apply to Black workers, and it's a much weaker story for the Hispanic workers. So what do we conclude from here? What is the implication of these findings? So motherhood wage gap is a major contributor to the gender wage gap. Actually, these are the second largest observable sources behind occupations. But at the same time, it's just too simplistic to completely reduce gender wage gap just to mothers versus others. As we saw, and we still need to make an ongoing effort to address the policies, addressing factors relevant for unmarried and childless women, but as well as we need to pay closer attention to the racial heterogeneity.